So
I was a
explain.
hitchhiking hooker.
Hi there, my name's Leisha. I'm a real-life lawyer on a mission to demystify the law and how it affects your everyday life. Today I want to talk to you about the trial of Aileen Wuornos, America's lady serial killer. She was a sex worker and a complicated character who killed a bunch of dudes and was put to death for it. I want to talk to you about her today because I watched the film Monster at an age that was too young, so it lives rent-free in my mind, and also because her case raises a lot of questions about how our justice system handles mental health, trauma, and the importance of restorative justice, or lack thereof. So let's get into it, but first, let me tell you that I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. Nothing that I say should be construed as legal advice. You should always seek the advice of a licensed attorney if you have any legal questions. I am also not a criminal law expert. I am just doing some research and sharing with you a little bit of insight into our legal system, while also learning a bunch as well, and I hope you'll come along with me. I'm also going to be putting on a little makeup, because why not? What all the kids are doing, what the people want. Oh, let me give the trigger warning that this story involves sexual assault, a lot of violence, really traumatic history, I mean, the whole thing. But you did click on a true crime video, so I assume you're signed on for this, so let's do it. Aileen was born February 29th, 1956 in Michigan. She actually never knew her father. He was imprisoned for child predation, and then he actually later killed himself while in prison. So, not a great start. By the time Aileen was 3, her mom was pretty much out of the picture, and her brother were living with her grandparents. Now, her grandparents, they were alcoholics. We're talking about generations of trauma here with Aileen's story. And unfortunately, Aileen's grandfather and her friends sexually abused Aileen from a really young age. And by 11, she was selling sexual favors to get money and food at school. And at 14, she actually got pregnant by one of her grandfather's friends. She had the child at a home for unwed mothers, which was a thing in the 70s, and gave birth to the child in 1971. And she put the baby up for adoption. Not long after that, she dropped out of high school, which, I mean, makes sense. And then her grandmother actually died of liver failure. And after that, her grandfather kicked her out of the house. So by the age of 15, she was living on her own in the woods near her home and selling sex for her basic needs, which I'm pretty sure this all happened in Michigan, which, like, the whole story is awful, but I can't imagine living in the woods in Michigan. So throughout her life, Aileen had a number of run-ins with the law, which makes sense given that background that I just gave you, and she got DUIs and arrested for disorderly conduct and all sorts of things. By 1976, when she was 20 years old, she hitchhiked to Florida, where she promptly met a 69-year-old yacht owner, and they were married. That marriage was annulled 9 weeks later, and during that time she got arrested some more, and her brother died of esophagus cancer. And then throughout the early 80s, she was in and out of jail for various things: DUIs, robbery, theft, armed assault. Like, the crime started getting a little bit more intense, and instead of just being self-destructive, they were destructive towards other people. Then she met a hotel maid named Tyria Moore, and they started living with each other, and Aileen was supporting them with her sex work. I mean, can you imagine living that awful life, but then on top of it, you're a queer person living in the United States in the 70s and 80s? I mean, woof. So this was going on all throughout the 80s, and then for whatever reason in 1989 she cracked. She lost it, and she killed 7 men over the course of 1 year. All of those men were her sex work clients. All of them were middle-aged white guys that she shot at close range, and then she stole all of their stuff and their car and drove off. Like, she had a pretty established routine in the course of that year. She also was not particularly careful with her crime. She was seen multiple times by witnesses with the victims' cars. She left handprints all over the cars after she abandoned them, and she tried to pawn off one of their registered guns. And her prints were already on file in Florida because she had a criminal record, so, like, it didn't take much to find her. Ultimately, she was found and arrested at a biker bar in Florida called Last Resort, which is kind of an iconic way to go down. The authorities also arrested Tyria because Tyria was maybe not an accomplice to these crimes, but she knew they were happening, and she helped to protect Aileen. So they got Tyria and basically told Aileen that if Aileen didn't confess, that Tyria would face charges as well. And so through a series of phone calls, they got Tyria to get Aileen to confess to these murders. And she confessed to 7 murders. She said they were all her clients. And initially she said that she was acting in self-defense when she killed them. However, in taped confessions to the cops, she ended up recanting that story and saying she did it on purpose, and she ended up pleading guilty to 6 of those murders. No contest, guilty.
I have made peace with my Lord, and I have asked forgiveness.
I am sorry that my acts of self-defense ended up in court like this, but I take full responsibility for my actions.
I sentence you in case number 91-463 to death for the murder of Troy Burris.
Probably see, I'll be up in heaven while y'all rotting in hell.
So only one of the murders out of the 7 that she allegedly killed actually went to trial, because the rest she pled no contest or not guilty for. Well, one person, they never found his body, and like I've talked about in past videos, for murder there has to be a body to prove that there was a murder in the first place. So if there's no body, you don't really have a case usually. And so there were only 6 bodies, but she pled guilty to 5 of those murders. So there was only one case where she actually contested the charge against her, and that's the one case that ended up going to trial. So if you plead not guilty and no contest to a charge, it goes straight to the sentencing phase, and sometimes you can get a more lenient sentence if you plead guilty, because it saves everyone so much freaking time if you just plead guilty, and so people want to award you for that. Okay, so the one case that went to trial, the victim was named Richard Mallory. She was charged with first-degree murder, armed robbery with a firearm, and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. So we're in Florida State Court here. Again, if you watched my Bundy video, we were also in Florida State Court there, just like earlier in the 80s. Must have been a wild decade to be a Floridian. So there's a number of instances in Florida where a defendant can be punished with the death penalty for murder. So if you've like killed a cop, if the defendant murdered 2 or more victims, if it was a murder for hire, or if the murder occurred intentionally during a crime, such as burglary, armed robbery, things like that. These are called capital murders, so they get capital punishment. It all makes sense. Okay, and one thing that I didn't mention in the Bundy case, but it's important to know, is that in a capital murder type case where the defendant could be convicted of murder and then sentenced to death, the jury selection process is a little bit different. The jury has to be what's called death qualify, which means that every member of the jury testifies that they would be willing to give someone the death penalty if the law requires it. So basically, if a juror doesn't believe in the death penalty, they can't sit on a death qualified jury, because the law assumes that they wouldn't be able to give impartial sentences, which is true, but yikes. So Aileen's trial began on January 13th, 1992, which is precisely 3 days before my illustrious birth. So Aileen confessed in a videotaped confession that she did the murder, so they didn't have to prove that element. They were also able to introduce evidence of her other murders that she did plead guilty to. This is notable because typically the rules of evidence, at least at the federal level, take issue with using a person's other convictions against them in a trial, because it's not really fair to say, well, this person committed this crime this one time, so that proves that they committed it this time. Like, we want to give people the benefit of the doubt that we can't just find them guilty for all of similar crimes that they've done. Does that make sense? However, in Florida, they allow for use of collateral crimes, meaning related crimes, to prove intent or motive or some sort of pattern of behavior. So they were able to use her other crimes against her in this case to say, well, she did all of this, so she knew what she was doing, and there's a pattern here, and this fits the pattern. Which, I don't know, it seems like it doesn't work for me. Like, it still seems like there's a problem where you're saying, well, she did something like this similarly, so she should be found guilty of this one too. It doesn't definitively prove that she did this crime, it just proves she did these other crimes, so maybe she did this. I don't know, feels fishy. So in her taped confession to authorities, she had dropped the self-defense claim, and instead she said that she had gone off to a secluded area with Mallory, the victim, because she was gonna sell sex work to him. I don't know how to say that eloquently, but anyway, he was a client of hers, so they went to a secluded area, but then she realized that he didn't have the money to pay her. She thought he was gonna rob her, so she shot him. Then she stole his money and his car. And she confessed to this pretty easily on the tape. Like, it didn't look like it was coerced. She knew her rights. There was an attorney present. Like, there was no confession issues in that regard. She even said, I took a life. I'm willing to give up my life because I killed people. I deserve to die. However, if you remember Tyria Moore, the cops kind of used her to manipulate Aileen into confessing by saying that if she didn't confess, then Tyria was going to be convicted of something, or at least charged with something. However, this really isn't enough to show that Aileen was involved in a coerced confession. This is kind of par for the course with law enforcement. Like, they use these types of manipulative tactics pretty regularly. And the bar is really high to show coercion. Like, if you ever saw Making a Murderer, Brendan Dassey's confession, like, that looked bad. The tapes did not look good good for law enforcement, and he, to this day, continues to rot in prison despite that fact. So if you want to claim that your confession was coerced, it's a really high bar, and Aileen just doesn't meet that bar in this situation. The defense did argue this, however. They said that because they used Tyria Moore against her and her relationship with Tyria Moore to manipulate her into confessing, that it was a coerced confession, and the judge didn't buy that. Also, at this point, that confession tape had been leaked to the media, so like everyone had seen it, and there was a huge public sentiment against Aileen because she looked like a heartless murderer in that confession. And, you know, theoretically they found an impartial jury, but it's really hard to tell.
Tyria had another deal going with the arresting police. They were trying to sell Hollywood the movie rights to Lee Wuornos' life and crazy times.
Why did you lie to her about those number of things?
So it was the original taped confession where she confessed to murdering Mallory and dropped the self-defense claim that she had, but then in later confessions to the police, she said that it was in self-defense. She said that he had told her that he didn't have the money to pay, so she had tried to leave the situation, but he had whipped a cord around her neck and tried to strangle her. And then she said that he tied her up to the wheel and he committed like really atrocious acts of sexual violation and rape against her, and then he untied her and told her to lay down, and she thought that he was going to kill her, so she reached for her gun and there was a struggle, and then she ended up shooting him, and then he kept coming at her, so she shot him a few more times. So that was her subsequent story. I do note that it's a little bit of a fishy story, just in that, like, I don't know, if I were gonna kill someone, I probably wouldn't untie them first, but you know, we've learned from this channel that murderers can be kind of dumb sometimes. I'm looking at you, Bundy, so maybe it did happen. I don't know. However, even if that one part of the story is fishy, it's not entirely unreasonable to think that a victim of a violent assault would change her story. I mean, this is an area where the law is just really bad at taking into account the fact that victims are not the best witnesses, frankly, and that trauma causes someone to remember things differently, to suppress memories, to react in certain ways, or to remember certain things at a later date. Like, the law just doesn't really take that into account, and it's kind of not nuanced in that area where it's like, well, she said this one thing and then she changed her story so she can't be believed, period. As opposed to taking like a more empathetic, trauma-informed approach to the law and saying like, well, she has experienced severe trauma throughout her life, and if this trauma occurred the way that she said it occurred, it makes perfect sense why she maybe wouldn't have said something during her initial confession. On top of the fact that she was a sex worker, so a lot of times there's both stigma and shame attached to assault on sex workers, because there's basically the idea that they were asking for it and it's part of the hazards of doing the job. So she was probably also feeling some sort of shame, or like she didn't get to say that it was self-defense because it's just part of her job. There's a lot of factors that go into this that the law just can't account for. So Aileen decided to take the stand in her own defense at her trial, which her defense attorneys did not recommend. See, defendants don't have to take the stand during their own trial. They have a right to, but they do not have to do it. And a lot of times it's not in their best interest for them to take the stand because they're not the best witnesses for themselves. They can get emotional, they can get defensive, they can say the wrong thing, or they can have a demeanor that the jury just isn't gonna like for whatever reason. I mean, a lot of defendants or accused criminals can be a little rough around the edges, which Aileen definitely was, so they don't necessarily present well to a jury, or they don't present sympathetically to a jury. And that's what happened here. She got emotional, she got defensive, she got really agitated when the prosecution was asking her questions, and it did not look good. Also, taking the stand opens a defendant up to certain attacks on their character and on their credibility that wouldn't necessarily come up if they didn't take the stand. And again, her credibility was questionable, and it was easier to question her credibility because she was, you know, a sex worker. That's like a common trope that people use, and the jury didn't find her credible. After the trial, they only took 2 hours to deliberate and came back with a guilty verdict. And then the next day, the sentencing began. The sentencing here had to happen before a jury because they had to determine whether to give her a life sentence or a death sentence, meaning whether they were going to put her in jail for the rest of her life or give her the death penalty. So it's basically like a mini trial when they do sentencing, and at this mini trial, the prosecution called some psychologists that said that she had borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, but that neither of these disorders made it so that she didn't know what she was doing when she committed the crime, and they didn't affect her ability to conform her actions to the law. So basically, like, yes, she's mentally ill, but she knew what she was doing, so she should die. They also called multiple members of her family basically to have them say that, like, yeah, her childhood was bad, but it wasn't that bad. And then the defense on their side called psychologists, 3 psychologists, who all said that she had borderline personality disorder and that it so impaired her ability to function that at the time of the crime she didn't really know what she was doing. They also presented evidence of her pretty horrific childhood, and they presented evidence that she had an IQ of about 81, which is low and is notable because the Supreme Court has since held that someone between 70 and 75 can't be put to death because they don't have the mental capacity. So there are just layers of like mental health issues, trauma, like mental disabilities, whatever you want to call it. Like there's so much going on here that the law just, I mean, they took it into consideration, I guess, but it's just when you're in front of a jury of 12 people who are already certified that they're willing to give someone the death penalty, the idea of empathy seems like a little bit out of the question at that point. I mean, she did kill 7 people, so like, you know, I'm not saying that her crime wasn't heinous, but like, I don't know, I'm capable of enough empathy to see like how her life story led to some murders. Would I do the murders? No, of course not. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I have empathy powers that are capable of understanding how her life led to the outcome that it did, okay? So the jury found that she did suffer from borderline personality disorder, but that the aggravating factors, the fact that she killed so many people, that she like did it in the commission of a further crime, robbed them, etc., was enough to raise to the level of the death penalty. And they voted unanimously 12-0 in favor of giving her the death penalty. And in all, with that trial plus her other confessions, she was given 6 death penalty convictions. And she was convicted at the end of January 1992. In November of that same year, a reporter unearthed that Mallory, the victim, was actually a convicted sex felon and had served 10 years in prison. Now, typically a victim's criminal past, or their past generally, can't be used in a court situation. However, because she claimed self-defense, it could have been used in her self-defense claim to show that he had a propensity for violence and for sexual assault, like she claimed. However, the prosecution didn't disclose this information or didn't look for it, and I don't really know why the defense didn't look for it either. And on appeal, her old lawyers argued that she should have gotten a completely new trial because her defense team was clearly ineffectual because they didn't uncover that information. However, her appeals were all denied. Partially because during the appeal period, she was exhibiting more and more erratic behavior. She was acting weirdly in the court. She was acting out in court. Like, she was not demonstrating remorse or any sort of rehabilitation. And she was sending like rambling letters to the courts and things like that. So like, she didn't help her case necessarily. Not that that should necessarily matter, but it definitely didn't look good. However, in 2002, then Governor Jeb Bush, good old Jebediah, issued a stay on her execution, saying that more evaluation was needed to determine whether or not she was fit to be executed. Because apparently we want to make sure that a person is mentally sound before we murder them. So they did some evaluations, and 3 psychologists determined that she was in fact fit to be killed. And on October 9th, 2002, Aileen was executed via lethal injection in Florida.
So there must have been something in you that was getting you to
Oh,
do
you
that.
are lost, Nick!
So
I was a
explain-
hitchhiking hooker. You sabotaged my ass, society, and the cops, and the system. A raped woman got executed and was used for books and movies and shit. Ladder climbs, her election, everything else. I got a big finger in all your faces. Thanks a lot.
At her execution, Eileen's last words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." And if that alone isn't an indication of our criminal justice system's inability to show any sort of empathy for trauma, mental illness, things like that, I don't know what is. And I wanted to tell this story because I think Eileen's story is kind of a microcosm of the larger issue of our criminal justice system just not being able to take into consideration the number of layers in a person's life that can lead to committing crime, and then show any sort of empathy as to how they might need help more than they might need a death sentence. Things like poverty, lack of access to mental health services, lack of access to child protective services, creating social pariahs out of sex workers, especially the most vulnerable ones. These are all things that can exacerbate a person's underlying issues and lead them to commit crimes, but our laws and our criminal justice system can't take those into consideration. Did she commit 7 murders? Yeah, that's bad. That's not good. Does a person who's doing well and needs no help commit murders? Maybe sometimes, but for the most part, I think if you're doing bad things, it's probably because you need some help. But instead, we kill people instead, or we lock them up for the rest of their lives. But if you've been following me on TikTok or on Instagram, you'll know that I've been talking a lot about the death penalty lately because Trump has been expediting federal executions leading up to his leave of office, which is the first time any president has done that since the 1800s. And people are being put to death that there are still questions remaining as to their innocence and to their case. But even if there aren't, even if someone has committed a heinous crime, I don't want a state that murders people or that thinks that it can murder people, because they technically are killing people in our name for our safety with our taxpayer dollars. And that's not the kind of world I want to live in, because I don't want to live in a world where instead of showing empathy, we just kill people. I don't think we have the right to make that determination of who gets to live or who gets to die. And we get it wrong so often that it just doesn't make sense to continue it as a practice. It's medieval. It's not justice. Okay, so anyway, that got deep. Thank you for watching. Huge shout out to the website Capital Punishment in Context, which offered a lot of information for this video today. Comment below if you have any thoughts on this, or if there is a story or true crime that you want me to dig into next. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good day. Goodbye.